السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الذي لا إله سواه الواحد الأحد الفرد الصمد الذي لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد، والحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه أبدا سرمدا، حمدا يليق بجلاله وجماله وكماله وعظيم سلطانه وجزيل نعمائه، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف أنبيائه محمد الطيب الطاهر الصادق الأمين الرسول المبين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الطاهرين الطيبين وأصحابه الغر الميامين والتابعين لهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين، اللهم اجعلنا منهم آمين. Welcome to all of you, my dear brothers and sisters, for this day, inshallah ta'ala, where we are getting together to expose ourselves to ilm, to shari'i ilm, inshallah ta'ala, in the context of what we have always been so far learning, in the context of the cleansing of our souls and spirits and hearts and minds and senses and limbs, all in loving desire for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Today, inshallah ta'ala, the focus, as you know, is on the concept of difference. The differences that do exist in the framework of our noble, sacred Islamic knowledge. The focus on that within the concept of difference will be on the issue of the fiqh, the jurisprudence concerning bid'ah and sunnah, inshaAllah ta'ala. So, an outline for what we will be covering, inshaAllah ta'ala, today, hopefully, bi'idhnillah, as Allah permits through the time we have, is as you have in front of you, we're going to look at the sources, first of all, of Islamic knowledge. And then from that, speak a little bit and derive a little bit some reasoning pertaining to the sources of unity versus disunity amongst Muslims, because oftentimes what we know or what we do not know are sources of disunity or unity, and how what we are studying here is very essential in terms of, if we know it properly, very essential in terms of preserving and promoting the unity amongst Muslims. And then we begin on the question of bid'ah itself. And then in the analysis of that, I will first present you with the main texts from the Quran and from the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wasallam pertaining to that issue. And then we begin the analysis of those texts in a fiqhi, scholarly approach, hopefully as simplified as possible. And then we will mention examples in that analysis in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam of this concept of innovation in the religious sense of bid'ah, and examples in the times of the companions, that is after the passing away of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And we will also emphasize that and adorn that, if you will, with the many statements or many of the statements excuse me, of our traditional scholars throughout the four schools of thought and more, and throughout the times as well. And that will enable us also to speak of the concept of a classification of bid'ah, what types of bid'ah there are, as the scholars have established. And then we will deal with certain questions. I call that contested examples of bid'ah. Is that bid'ah or is that not? And why not? As clearly and as also briefly as possible. And then what are the proper attitudes on our parts towards the differences on that subject matter even when they exist, and we conclude bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. I hope inshallah ta'ala that Allah Azza wa Jalla will grant you and all of us focus in our hearts and minds so that we can patiently follow. And I, inshallah ta'ala, ask you indeed for your patience and your forbearance during this many hours together, inshallah ta'ala, in the hope and the desire that we will learn something bi'idhnillah, hopefully important, if not even special bi'idhnillah. So, the first part is this, as we speak of the sources of Islamic knowledge. Usually we have a text from the Quran, for example, or the Sunnah to deal with an issue, to answer a fiqh issue. Now, if we have a text from the Quran or a text from the Sunnah and the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the ahadith of the Sahaba, of the companions, radiallahu ta'ala anhum wa arwahum, that by itself is a requirement, is needed. That's called a dalil. A dalil is that which guides me to what I want. A dalil is not a proof. A dalil is an evidence. And I need to mount a proof from the evidence. And mounting the proof from the evidence is what I have in that box. Al-usul al-fiqhiyya, analysis and synthesis and etc. That needs equipment, linguistic equipment, logical equipment in a sense. It needs theorems and axioms that are going to be used to operate on the text that we have to come up with a conclusion. So, an evidence, a dalil by itself is not sufficient. It is necessary, but not sufficient. The dalil and the process of analysis, which is in the box, which requires mastery also of the rules of Islamic jurisprudence, of the rules of juristic thinking, and of the rules before that of linguistics as well in the Arabic language. That and more is required to come out with a conclusion, the verdict, the Shari'i verdict, if you will. And therefore, the next thing I would like to share about this, which is also important in this regards, are the sources of our knowledge, of our Islamic knowledge, in the Shari'i sense. As we have been pointing out, some time ago, that the sources of Islamic knowledge are not only the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Those are the primary sources. You must know that the ultimate source of our Islamic knowledge in the Sharia sense is the Quran. And it is the Quran that tells us that the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, is an authority, is a source of knowledge. And both the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam both tell us that there are other sources that most of the ulama have approved of in, for example, all the four schools of thought, such as we have al-ijma', consensus, al-qiyas, reasoning by analogy. We have al-istihsan, some would call it juristic preference. Al-istihsan is a model of reasoning that the scholars have developed from analysis of what the Quran says and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam both say, to argue that sometimes the scholar sees through an intellectual, rational, shari'i, I would say, inspiration, that, for example, using this process of qiyas is not good. Yet qiyas by itself is a source. But in this case, they would rather, for another reason that is a shari'i reason as well, such as observing the probable cause, the probable consequences, such as observing and quantifying the probable maslaha or mafsada, for example, benefit or harm, or sometimes in more technical language, sometimes moving from qiyas jali to qiyas khafi. That's they call istihsan, for example. That's another model of shari'i reasoning that is not textual in the Quran or in the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. We have saddu dhara'i, blocking of the means, meaning blocking of the means to something probably harmful in the shari'i sense, harmful to one's faith, to one's iman, to one's religion, to one's deen, or harmful to one's life or limbs, or harmful to one's preservation and promotion of intellectual, rational, reasonable health, aql, and so on. So, if in the analysis probably it would lead to harm, they said we block the means to harm. That's a source of Islamic reasoning, not necessarily textual in the Quran or in the Sunnah, for instance. Even if it is not in the Quran nor in the Sunnah, and if the analysis in the scholarly sense, with the practical sense, leads to probable cause for harm, then it is to be taken as a means to act through a fatwa or through an opinion to prevent that harm. Sadd al-dharai, al-masalih al-mursala, now benefits that are not specifically mentioned in the Quran or in the Sunnah, specifically, but in general, their genre, their type is established through the Quran and the Sunnah, for example. But as a specific example, it is not in the Quran or in the Sunnah, nor is it rejected in the Quran or in the Sunnah, but not specifically mentioned and required in the Quran or in the Sunnah. That becomes a means of Islamic scholarly reasoning as a source of knowledge as well. We have al-urf, even custom, to be taken as also a source of Islamic knowledge when all these have not found a solution. We don't have a solution to all of these. Al-urf, that does not negate or go against a textual statement in the Quran or in the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that would be consistent with the overall objectives of the Sharia. That urf is taken, that custom is taken seriously as a means of Islamic Shari'i reasoning to come to a solution of a problem. Al-istishab. Al-istishab is a rule of evidence, is a source of evidence, or an evidence, source of knowledge, that says the following. It means the following, that we leave everything as is, as long as there is nothing that requires it to change. So if we found a matter or an issue as it is, istishab, meaning we keep that condition as it is. We don't modify it, we don't change it. We keep it as it is, as long as there is no explicit evidence to the contrary that requires it to change. For example, if someone is in possession of something, then somebody comes and claims that's mine, and he does not bring evidence through a contract and witnesses or court evidence or something that it is his in accordance to his claim, then istishab requires that the property keeps belonging to the person who had it before the case was brought against him, for example. That's an example of istishab. And in matters of religious issues as well, in ibadat and in mu'amalat, that evidence, that's evidence, and that's a source of Islamic knowledge, etc. And the opinion of one of the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if it does not contradict any text in the Quran or in the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is taken by many of the ulama as also a source of Islamic knowledge. And even shar'u man qablana, that is the law that was followed by those people of the scriptures before us, in particularly the Jewish teachings and the Christian teachings. If we don't have a solution through all of those previous means, and there is nothing that contradicts it or opposes it in the Quran or in the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or in consensus, and so on and so forth. So these are sources of Islamic knowledge. Not only the Quran or the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it is the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to emphasize that inform us of all of such possible and actual sources of knowledge. And you realize at this point that those of us who are not familiar with this, or those who are familiar with this but do not practice that, or forget that, or do not apply that well, that becomes a source of what? Of differences and of disunity. That becomes a source of not only differences, but negative differences of disunity. And oftentimes that occurs. Tell me, give me your evidence. And if one is bringing an evidence from the scholarly reference, with a scholarly reference, not in the Quran, not in the Sunnah, they say, no, I don't accept it. That's not what the ulama have ever said. What happened to ijma'? What happened to qiyas? What happened to istihsan? What happened to sadd al-dhara'i'? What happened to al-masalih al-mursala? What happened to al-istishab? What happened to, and so on, al-urf? What happened to? No. That's already, if we know it well and apply it well, already, well, alhamdulillah, prevents many unnecessary conflicts. Now, the next thing, as speaking of the sources of knowledge, one other point of contention that is very important within the concept of the sources of Islamic knowledge, and that is issues concerning hadith, in particular weak hadith. First of all, most know, if not all of us and of you know, that when it comes to the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and when it comes to, in more general terms, the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the hadith of a companion, which is hadith mawquf, there are technical requirements that the scholars, rahimahullah ta'ala, of old, if you will, in the second level of the traditional ancient knowledge and the basis of our knowledge, Islamic knowledge, that second layer of the ancient scholars have established rules by which to identify and to classify the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in particular. And that is the hadith that is sahih, hasan, and da'if. Authentic, good, which is a level of authoritative text but less than the sahih in authority, and the weak. Now, most have learned, and I don't know whether it applies here or not, and probably most of you, if not all, have learned that the weak hadith we do not use. It is rejected. As a matter of fact, there are some of the contemporary scholars who have, I think, become an exception, one or some of them, rahimahullah ta'ala, that the hadith da'if, the weak hadith, is not at all a source of knowledge. For any reason, in matters of dogma, in matters of aqidah, of faith, essentials of faith, in matters of laws for the specific, fil furu', fil ahkam, in legal fiqhi verdicts, nor even in fada'ilul a'mal, nor even in matters of virtues and morality, not applied at all. What I want to say here, I want to spend some time here, that is an innovated view, meaning that such a view and such an opinion has not been the opinion of the early masters of hadith and the early masters of fiqh, and also most, if not all, of the masters of those disciplines throughout the times. However, it needs some more specifics, and that is, when they say, rahimahullah ta'ala, al-hadith al-da'if, for example, لا يعمل به في الأحكام, that the weak hadith is not to be used as an authority for practice and for acting in matters of fiqhi legal verdicts. Many take that statement as general and all-inclusive. The answer, when they say that, they mean by it not in the sense that many have understood and many have said, and some contemporary scholars have mentioned. The ulama of old did not mean it to be completely not usable at all in even the field of ahkam. They meant it to be not used in the sense of without conditions. But the weak hadith has been used by the earliest masters of the field of hadith and of the field of fiqh with certain conditions. Such as when in an area, in a question, when we want a fiqhi answer, in that area there is no text, for example, from the Quran, nor a strong text from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, for example, nor a strong text from the practice of the companions radiallahu ta'ala anhum wa ardahum. There is no text. Otherwise, then these masters have used the weak hadith as an authority. Number one, in the absence of other strong text. When there are no other texts and strong text. Second, if there is a weak hadith only available, or weak hadith available, and one is using qiyas, reasoning by analogy, many of the earliest ulama their logical and spiritual preference is weak hadith over qiyas, over reasoning by analogy. And reasoning by analogy is a source of Islamic knowledge. But between qiyas and personal scholarly, we're talking about even mujtahidun, not nowadays, and some of us who have studied 6 years or 12 years and we think we are full-fledged scholars. But these are mujtahidun. And that the opinion of a mujtahid is subservient to the source of, that is weak hadith. Weak hadith takes precedence over the liberal opinion of a mujtahid. I mean by liberal, that is something that is not from the texts, in the absence of texts. Also, they took and they applied and they used weak hadith in ahkam, even in fiqhi ahkam, about halal and haram and mustahab and so on. In ahkam, for example, if that text throughout the earliest generations of scholars and of this ummah, that weak text has been accepted. تلقي بالقبول تلقاه أهل العلم بالقبول. That's for them an indication of its veracity. If also that weak hadith, most of the ulama or a large number of the ulama up to that point of that weak hadith, we're talking about the 2nd, the 3rd century Hijri, we're talking about that early. Those scholars have given fatawi on the basis that is consistent with that weak hadith. And that weak hadith becomes authoritative and it is used. Weak hadith is also used by almost all of the scholars, and certainly all of the scholars of old, when it comes to fada'ilul a'mal, when it comes to acts of virtue, such as dhikr, and salawat, and nawafil, and dua, and moral behavior, and so on. All of them. Imam al-Nawawi, rahimahullah ta'ala, for example, says, establishing this rule, reminding the scholars of it, his students, وَيَجُوزُ عِنْدَ أَهْلِ الْحَدِيثِ وَغَيْرِهِمْ التَّسَاهُلُ فِي الْأَسَانِيدِ ورواية سوى الموضوع من الضعيف والعمل به من غير بيان ضعفه في غير صفات الله والأحكام كالحلال والحرام ومما لا تعلق له بالعقائد والأحكام. Basically, Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala is telling us the rule is amongst the early scholars of hadith and others, and he was a scholar of hadith and of fiqh together, rahimahullah ta'ala, that amongst the scholars of hadith and the others, and the fuqaha and so on, and the usul, that when it comes to, when it is outside of the realm of aqeedah, and outside of the realm of juristic fiqhi verdicts pertaining to halal and haram, in other words, here he means matters of fada'ilul a'mal, matters and acts of virtues, that those ulama of hadith and of fiqh, they are lenient and easy when it comes to the chains of narrations of the hadith. They are more lax. They are easier. They don't require authenticity. As long as the text, even if the text is da'if, and as long as it is not spurious, mawdu', fabricated, and the ulama know that. Even he says, under these cases, when it comes to matters of virtues, acts of virtues, as long as the text is not spurious, they do not even have to say that this text is a weak text. of those who have used weak text of our earliest generations and now, you have names in front of you there. Abu Dawood, Sunan Abu Dawood. Of his principle is he uses, rahimahullah ta'ala, weak hadith in ahkam, in fiqhi verdicts. As long as there is no other text against it that is more authentic, or another text in that chapter or on that question. He uses it as an authority. يَحْتَجُّ بِهِ رَحِمَهُ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى. And these are the masters of the early masters of the discipline of hadith and hadith terminology and hadith standards and hadith logic and so on, rahimahullah ta'ala. Similarly, Al-Imam al-Tirmidhi, and we have texts in each case supporting this concept, this statement. Imam al-Tirmidhi also, his book, his Jami' is filled, rahimahullah ta'ala, with texts, authentic and weak with the condition, and he mentions weak, وَعَلَيْهِ الْعَمَلُ عِنْدَ الْفُقَهَاءِ. Weak, however, this content of this hadith is applied by the ulama that is in his time and up to his time from earlier on. And he lived in the 3rd century Hijri, rahimahullah ta'ala. He was one of the students of Imam al-Bukhari. Imam Abu Dawood was one of the students of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, rahimahumullah ta'ala jami'an. An-Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, all of them, al-Bukhari, Muslim, all of them have used weak texts. Al-Bukhari has used a lot of weak texts, in particular outside his Sahih. And he knows they are weak. But what he's conveying the message that weak texts are used as authority under certain conditions. And he's mentioning them and under those conditions being implied. For example, even in his Sahih, rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentions ta'liqan, as the ulama say. Ta'liqan, in other words, a chain of narration in which there is one missing from the last person to the source of that knowledge. He mentions texts like that which are defined technically as weak, but he mentions them, as Imam al-Hafiz ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala says, he mentions that text because that text is supported by the concept of the scholars up to that point have been practicing the madmoon of that text, have been practicing the meaning, the practical meaning that that text conveys. In his work, rahimahullah ta'ala, Al-Adab al-Mufrad of Imam al-Bukhari, Al-Adab al-Mufrad is filled, there's plenty of weak texts. And he knows they are weak, but he uses them as evidence because it is there in matters of acts of virtues, fada'ilul a'mal. For instance, rahimahullah ta'ala, وهكذا. That's the tradition. Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, as a faqih and alim of hadith, who had certain conditions to require as a faqih and a muhaddith for a text to be authentic, of which some disagreed with. But he, rahimahullah ta'ala, used weak texts also. In the face of qiyas, in the face of reasoning by analogy. He'd rather take a weak text than reasoning by analogy sometimes. Because for him, it seemed that weak texts are stronger evidence than reasoning by analogy. Example, many of you or some of you know in the madhab and the opinion of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, al-qahqaha, laughing loud, what does it do to salah? That's only in his madhab. تبطل الصلاة. تبطل الصلاة. This What is his basis? His basis is a text that all the scholars, technical scholars of hadith, say it is weak. And he knows it is weak. It's not that he doesn't know. Many have given the impression that when some scholars use a weak text, they are using it, oh, it's weak, and they didn't know. Most of the time, you're wrong. They knew that very well. And they chose that very well on the basis of a logical argument, a logical Shari'i argument. In this case, Imam Abu Hanifa's principle, though the text is weak, but he prefers it over reasoning by analogy. But by analogy, you have not done anything in salah that breaks your wudu. Salah is batila if you break your wudu in salah. And you have not done anything that is of the same nature of what Rasulullah ﷺ taught us of that which breaks wudu. Passing gas, urinating, defecating, etc. None of that happened. Qiyas, in other words, requires that salah is not batila. Salah is not batila. It's wrong to do that. It's wrong to do that. But would salah be batila, meaning not only salah batila, but your wudu is nullified. Qiyas does not lead to wudu being nullified by qahqah inside salah. Because outside salah, you perform wudu and you laugh loud, your salah is not, your wudu is not broken. But why did he argue that? Abu Hanifa is very, very smart, rahimahullah ta'ala, when it comes to analysis especially. And it's not that he didn't see that. He's a master of qiyas, rahimahullah ta'ala. He's a master of reasoning by analogy. But what did he do? There was a weak text. And his principle, his logical principle is that a weak text takes precedence over qiyas. And there are many examples, such as al-wudu'u bi nabidh al-tamr, performing wudu with water in which there were dates that have been there, and it's like a juice, date juice or date drink, water or dates in it, and sweetness of the dates and the color change. And in his opinion, you can perform wudu with that. Why? It's not because he's very intelligent. Maybe he's wrong, but the point is, what did he base himself on, rahimahullah ta'ala? He used the weak text. Because there is a weak text on that issue. And he prefers the weakness of the text over reasoning by analogy. This doesn't mean he uses weak texts all the time on this issue. If the choice is between reasoning by analogy and weak texts. And I can go on. Examples. Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala. It is well established in the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Not that he doesn't know, as some students of knowledge, beginners, and some 4-year students of Asilari Dhalik think that when Imam Malik in his Muwatta had what we call technically weak hadith, that he didn't know. That's not studying well already. Questions we leave to the time, inshallah ta'ala. So in the Muwatta, Al-Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala has plenty of hadith, mursala, munqati'a, mu'dala. Technical terms, don't worry about them. All this means that these texts are technically weak texts. And he did that knowingly. Because that's what was available for him pertaining to some issues. And that for him, and in the school of the Maliki school, that's an authority in the absence, of course, of other texts that are strong. Al-Imam Shafi'i, hadith wala haraj. Al-Imam Shafi'i also is well known, rahimahullah ta'ala, to act upon weak ahadith. When they oppose, when it is a choice between them and qiyas, or the absence of other texts, for example, that are strong, and use, for example, such texts. One of his teachers of hadith is well-known figure, Ibrahim ibn Abi Yahya, rahimahullah ta'ala, is well known to the scholars of hadith that he was a weak scholar of hadith. And they have proper definitions of what they mean by weak scholar of hadith. And yet he used his hadith, Imam Shafi'i, as an authority. Because for him the weak hadith is not because it's weak, it is rejected in totality. On the contrary, it is looked at the issue, what issue it is, what are the alternatives available, and then they, as great mujtahids, they sometimes use the weak hadith indeed. And this is still in Ahkam. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal is well known. As a matter of fact, he himself sarraha bidhalik. He himself explicitly said that part of my approach in hadith and hadith analysis is I accept the hadith weak in the face of qiyas and in the absence of other texts. I use that. One time, for example, one of his students, rahimahullah ta'ala, told him about a hadith. What do you think of this hadith? What is your view on this hadith? Hadith that starts, كل الناس أكفاء إلا كذا كذا إلا الحائك والحجام and so on. He said, I act upon it. He said to him, the student said, the student is learning. He said, you act upon it, but you say this hadith is weak. See, it's not that they didn't know. But he said to him, the student, you say, oh my dear teacher, that this hadith is weak. He said, he replies, rahimahullah ta'ala, إنما نضعف إسناده والعمل عليه. إنما نضعف إسناده والعمل عليه. He replied, rahimahullah ta'ala, the weakness that we have mentioned is about its isnad, its chain of narration. However, acts have been always, that is up to this point, this text has been acted upon, that is by the scholars, the mujtahidun up to that point. Even if it were weak, even in ahkam. وهكذا. All of them have used that with conditions. It's not only, for example, Imam Ahmad. Imam Ahmad has declared that even explicitly. But all of the ulama. وَلَيْسَ أَحَدٌ مِّنَ الْعُلَمَاءِ إِلَّا يُوَافِقُهُ فِي الْجُمْلَةِ عَلَى مَا ذَهَبَ إِلَيْهِ. As Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala says, that all of the rest of the ulama rahimahullah ta'ala, like the four ulama of the madhahib, they all have the same view as Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal on this issue. Now, this issue is very important. Because hadith weak, as though, yes, the ulama have identified weak hadith. But what does that imply? If we say by weak hadith, it implies that it is completely rejected, like as if it were the worst kind of weak hadith. And what is the worst kind of weak hadith? Mawdu', exactly, the spurious one. The spurious one is to be rejected. And to treat every weak hadith as though it were spurious, mawdu', weak, that is wrong. That is not what the masters of this field of knowledge and of scholarship of old have said and have done. So those of us who hear it or read it now, I would like us to be exposed, let me put it politely, to be exposed to this knowledge as well, which is the most prevalent information and the most prevalent opinion amongst the ulama and the scholars and the scores of scholars of all of the madhab. By the way, even Imam Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri, those of you who know him, says the same thing, rahimahullah ta'ala. Even. And the scholars after them, rahimahullah ta'ala. All of them, they say the same thing. We, however, for example, al-amalu alayh. The ulama have been practicing that. Imam al-Tirmidhi say, in this jami' that I collected, Sunnah al-Tirmidhi, Jami' al-Sahih al-Tirmidhi, he said, I have not included any hadith except two. A hadith upon which the ulama did not act. All the hadith are used, even the weak ones, and he knows they are weak. Even the weak ones have been acted upon by the ulama. I'm talking about the 3rd century Hijri, in other words, before him until his time. And when we know that, that's knowledge we cannot disregard. And many, even some ulama, alim of a century ago, even a century ago, was writing. Yet nowadays, most if not all people, when they hear the word weak hadith are not authoritative, they take it in the absolute sense, in the most general sense, and they think under all conditions, and it's rejected under all conditions. And the answer to that is no, no, no. And in the absence of this, there will be what? Differences and conflicts and disunity. Then the ulama, after they analyze their texts, after they give a fatwa, they establish a verdict, hukm shar'i, a verdict. That hukm shar'i is either taklifi or wad'i. Some of you know this jargon. It's very simple. That's to say, the result of the analysis of a scholar is to lead to either hukm taklifi or hukm wad'i. What is a hukm taklifi? Hukm taklifi is one of those 5 categories. Wajib, or mustahab, or haram, or makruh, or mubah. That's hukm taklifi. It's that simple. Because it imposes responsibility upon the subject of the law. Hukm wad'i, what is hukm wad'i? Hukm wad'i is not secular law, don't think about that. Hukm wad'i, in the technical use of our earliest ulama, wad'i is that which is either illa, or sabab, or shart, or a mani', for example, for hukm taklifi. In other words, the concept of a requirement, a prerequisite, a condition. This is a condition for that. Wudu is a condition for salah, for the obligation for salah. Wudu is a condition for the validity of salah. So, condition, that's shart. Mani', an impediment against the validity of something or the application of something. Mani'. For example, a person who kills somebody, the act of killing is a mani', is an impediment against he or she inheriting from the person they killed. Or a person who, for example, passes gas. Passing gas becomes a mani' against performing salah. وهكذا. A sabab, a cause for something. Something should be a cause and an operative cause, a illa for something else. What is the sabab for the obligation of beginning to fast the month of Ramadan? رؤية الهلال. As the text teaches, seeing, the sighting of the crescent. That's a sabab for the obligation of to begin to fast. وهكذا. Now, and then that result is either dhanni or qat'i. The scholarly result is either dhanni, probabilistic, or qat'i, definitive. When they say probabilistic, the alim who gives a fatwa, a mujtahid alim who gives a fatwa could be that hukm of wajib, he says, or this is shart, or this is haram, or this is mubah, or this is sabab, or this is illah. That statement is either probabilistic or definitive. Dhanni or qat'i. Probabilistic meaning he cannot say this is 100% sure. But it is, in other words, very likely to be the right answer. More than 50% probability. Qat'i, like almost 100% probability. Now, why is this important to mention in the context of difference? First of all, qat'i and dhanni, right? There are answers that are probabilistic and there are answers that are definitive. And especially in the probabilistic realm, there should be more openness. Instead of harshness. You can negotiate that in the scholarly sense, not by I negotiate it with Imam Malik. Yes, indeed. And the attitude towards it changes. That's why our ulama say this is very important. Whereas if somebody even rejects with denial and with obstinacy, he rejects a dhanni verdict, that's not a kafir. That's a fasiq. But if he or she rejects a qat'i verdict, that could lead to, that's a kufr if they do not desist and etc. etc. And some make no difference between the two at all. Weak hadith, as we say, most of the ulama use it and they apply it, and it is a source of knowledge. And if some exception of amongst us in modern times or even before have said otherwise, and that's a source of conflict, and yet it is wrong. And they should be more open. We should be more open if we know these facts, if these are facts. We have no choice but to be open. Because a weak hadith does not mean that we are sure that Rasulullah did not say it, as long as it is not very, very weak, meaning like spurious, mawdu'. Weak are levels. There is weak, very minimal weakness. There is medium weakness. There is upper medium. There is intense weakness. And there is weakness that is like mawdu', spurious. There are different levels. So because of those different levels, it does not mean that any weak hadith we say Rasulullah did not say it. No, that's not what it means logically. Logically, it means we are not sure that he said it, and we are not sure that he did not say it. And the less weak it is, the more there is room for probability. And so if you reject it all, even if it is lightly weak, you could have rejected actually teaching of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because when they say weak, it is the sanad that is weak, the chain that is weak. As long as the content does not oppose in any direct way the explicit teachings of the Quran, for example, or the explicit teachings of hadith mutawatir and strong ahadith. That still leaves it open. To say يفيد الظن المرجوح and therefore it is rejected, some say it implies least probable, therefore it is rejected. That's not logical. Because there is still possibility that it was said. And indeed, the ulama, the experts in this field, like Imam Ahmad and Al-Bukhari, and before them Imam Malik and Sufyan al-Thawri and Al-Awza'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, and later on the masters of those names whom we mentioned, Abu Dawud and so on, and later on Ibn Abd al-Barr, latest like Al-Hafiz Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and Al-Dhahabi and the Fuqaha Muhaddithun of late times like Al-Shawkani. All of these have argued in this way that I'm sharing with them, only exposing us to what many have not been exposed to, even when we study in colleges sometimes. And therefore, knowing that minimizes those differences. And on top of that, all we need to, after this, the alim, the scholar, the mujtahid, looks at the objectives of Islamic law. And after looking at the objectives of the Islamic law, the intent and the objectives of the law, of the lawgiver, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and His Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, then with that analysis, then ultimately only then they could make the final verdict. And that includes a lot of things that I have here drawn for you to summarize all of that process. And these are some of the details in what was in the first box. Remember? The first box. This box. Inside of this box are these things, and what we said about these things, and what we said here, and what we said we're saying here. All of that is in there. Before the final verdict. And the final verdict is either probabilistic or qat'i or definitive. We're going to take our short recess here, inshallah ta'ala, for about 7 minutes, and then we will be back to continue, inshallah ta'ala. As I said, I will have time for questions, inshallah ta'ala, for sure. Don't worry about that. Some of the questions you might have could be answered as we go along. So just be patient, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. As we go along, your questions might already be answered. And if they're not answered, you will have, inshallah ta'ala, time to ask questions towards the end, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala.